I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just a few seconds early, but let's take this opportunity to say hello and thank you for joining us as you all enter the room for our live panel discussion this afternoon. My name is Chris Eddy. It is my pleasure to be the facilitator for today's discussion, the first in a series on tackling Victoria's housing crisis. And today, effective leadership in housing is our topic. Before I introduce our panellists, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respect to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'm personally coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation this afternoon. Can I take an opportunity to tell you a little bit about the VLGA? The VLGA Connect program is the flagship way that the VLGA has maintained connections with the sector over the past couple of years, particularly during COVID. But the VLGA does so much more. It supports councils and councillors to deliver great outcomes for their local communities through high performance and good governance. It's member-run and non-partisan. It aims to provide practical advice, direct support, training, professional development, events, networks and resources to members, and to carry out research, policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of local councils. The VLGA is one of the leading voices for local councils and offers members the opportunity to realise their true leadership potential and increase their impact. It has a mission of inspiring and enabling good governance in councils. To today's session, a few housekeeping notes. The Q&A box is there for you to use as we move through the session. If you think of a question that you would like to ask our panellists, we also have a chat function if you'd like to communicate with other attendees in the session. Now, we will monitor both of those. If you have a question and you don't feel like you want to type it out in the box, drop a message there to let us know that you'd like to ask a question, perhaps verbally, of the panellists, and we'll try and include that as well this afternoon. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all of those who've registered in the coming days. And what we do find is a lot of people register and don't, for whatever reason, attend live, but they do that so that they get notified and can watch back the session at their leisure. Let's get started on today's topic. Our subject is, of course, Victoria's housing crisis, the development process, the barriers to more housing development that exist, and we're aiming to help councillors and officers navigate their roles in addressing this housing crisis. And to help us do that, we have a terrific panel, may I say, this afternoon. The Deputy CEO of Infrastructure Victoria is with us, Dr. Allison Stewart. Allison is an experienced capital projects leader, strategist, academic and management consultant, specialising in infrastructure and energy. She's worked as an industry practitioner and a civil servant in jurisdictions around the world, including Tanzania, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And prior to joining Infrastructure Victoria, Allison was an executive at the Suburban Rail Loop Authority. Also joining us today, we have Jamie Sutherland, Director of Local Government and Regional Priorities at Homes Victoria, which works to ensure that all Victorians have access to safe, secure and affordable housing, working closely with industry, the not-for-profit sector and the community to build a sustainable housing system, as well as essential support services such as crisis accommodation and transitional accommodation. And last but not least, Melinda Jacobsen, who has more than 20 years' experience across a range of startups, national organisations and statutory authorities. Melinda is with MosaicLab as a senior facilitator. And since joining MosaicLab, Melinda has led the Homes Victoria North Richmond Precinct Master Plan conversations with a community perspectives group. And she'll talk to us about incorporating deliberative elements into these processes, and how we can deal with some of those wicked problems that arise when you're trying to align community expectations with what you're trying to achieve in terms of housing delivery in particular today. So there you go. I'm sure you'll agree. A great panel. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of them this afternoon. And I'll just repeat once more, if you'd like to add those questions and comments in the Q&A box and the chat box, we strongly encourage you to do that. Allison, I'd like to start with you and speak to you for a few moments. Firstly, good afternoon and welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be here and speaking to you today.
Lovely to have you with us. And it's pretty timely today. We were going to talk about your Home Choices work that came out a few months ago, but also a follow-up to that has been released and has got quite a bit of media coverage today, the Choosing Victoria's Future piece of work, which is part 2 of that. All of this is going to be relevant, I think, to the issues that we're talking about today, and points to, I think, the strong and robust body of evidence that you're developing there at Infrastructure Victoria to support the policy options for the Victorian government's consideration and the flow-through effects that that has, obviously, on councils. Firstly, in a broad sense, what is all of that evidence telling you and telling us about dealing with this housing crisis that we have at the moment?
It's a really good kind of encapsulation of what we've been trying to do, Chris. I would just like to begin my comments by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today. I'm on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd just like to extend my respect to elders past and present from that community, as well as to any others of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who are joining us today. In terms of the key things that we are really looking at here, we've been really exploring what kind of a future do we as Victorians want to have, and how can we really set in place the right policy tools to ensure that we are making really deliberate decisions about that future and not walking into a future that many of us don't want to experience. And these 2 reports that you mentioned, Our Home Choices, that was released in March, and Choosing Victoria's Future, released today, really provide 2 different perspectives on that same issue. Our Home Choices was really about trying to articulate the growth particularly in Melbourne's suburbs, but we also looked at the suburbs of Geelong and Ballarat, really trying to understand what were the key drivers that people are looking for in terms of purchasing on the fringes of those cities. We know, for example, that Plan Melbourne has a really clear policy aspiration for having 70% of growth in established areas and 30% growth in the growth areas, and yet we're seeing closer to 50-50 in Melbourne, and actually even greater proportions of growth happening in new growth areas, again around cities like Geelong and Ballarat. And that is really putting and exacerbating the pressure on infrastructure to be delivered in a lot of those areas. So from our perspective, we really wanted to understand what are the underlying reasons that people are making those choices, and what other choices would they make if different products were available, which is really where that first report, Our Home Choices, was seeking to provide some evidence. What we've then done with the second report today is really looked at 5 different ways that Victoria could grow into the future and tried to understand what the implications of those different growth patterns would be. And we looked in this report at the entirety of Victoria, and we said, we could see a lot of the population growth that we expect to come to Victoria being consolidated within Melbourne and really having a much more compact central city. Or we could see a very, very different type of growth. For example, we could see people actually spreading out quite a bit more significantly throughout the state. What would the implications of each of those and kind of all the scenarios in between be from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, from an economic perspective? And what would an appropriate infrastructure response to all of those different scenarios look like? And what that is really telling us is that our current pathway that we're on, not just for Melbourne, but for our regional cities as well, of that increasing expansion of our cities, is not the best option for all of us. And the challenge is that is really going to exacerbate social inequity issues. It's really going to entrench some of the challenges that we see already occurring in those growth areas around access to infrastructure. And it's going to actually mean that all of us collectively are worse off from an economic perspective. And that is in addition to the fact that we are going to consume an enormous amount of extra land if we do continue to grow in the way that we're growing. We've estimated that to be a minimum of 30,000 hectares if we continue to grow in the same way that we are now, which equates to approximately 12,000 times the field size of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. So there's a really significant implication for a whole range of quality of life outcomes for us if we don't make the appropriate choices at this stage.
Allison, that I know from your Home Choices work back in March, there were a number of recommendations to the state government. I'm assuming there's recommendations coming out of part 2 today. I haven't had a chance to see that yet. I'm wondering how you feel the recent government announcements about housing and planning reforms align with what Infrastructure Victoria's body of evidence is saying in terms of the direction.
Yeah, so we were very enthused to see the housing statement. We think that that's a really good sign that the government is actually taking some positive steps to really consider what the future needs to look like. In particular, we welcomed their announcement that they're preparing a new plan for Victoria, which we understand is going to be an update to Plan Melbourne, but actually encompass not just Melbourne, but all of our other really important growth across the state as well. And so from that perspective, that's really positive. And a lot of the initial planning changes that have been signaled, we think will help to alleviate some of the concerns we've highlighted in our previous reports. We do think that there's further more to do, further ways that we would like to see the government acting. In particular, we recognize that some of the more challenging areas of things like infrastructure contributions reform, really considering how our existing financial incentives, including taxes and grants, are really driving certain types of growth that haven't yet been tackled. And if we don't actually look at those elements, then actually we are on the one hand stating that we would like a particular type of urban form, and on the other hand really supporting a very different type of growth. And our recommendations in our report today are really about bringing those two things together, having a more clear and transparent plan for the growth of the whole state, and ensuring that our infrastructure plans are lined up with that growth, and ideally are made transparent so that people and industry can make the choices about where they're choosing to live and how they're choosing to build, where businesses are choosing to locate, with a bit more transparency about what they can expect from an infrastructure perspective.
Allison, one of the themes I suspect we'll hear a bit through our discussions today is that of NIMBYism. And there's a school of thought that this is developed due to the negative experiences people have had with urban densification and poorly executed developments and insufficient infrastructure, some of the things that you've highlighted, particularly in Home Choices. What's your take on, or your view on that premise, that that's how NIMBYism has come about, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not unique in having NIMBYs here in Victoria, but certainly one of the biggest challenges we have as a state, but particularly with the city of Melbourne, is that we are in an incredibly low density city by global standards. And while that has been possible to grow in that way and to continue to deliver a good quality of life for a period of time, we are now facing a situation that many other cities have had before, in that you cannot continue along that same pattern and actually have a livable city. Otherwise, what you get is something more like Los Angeles, where you have a very, very sprawling city, and the requirements that then puts on people. And, you know, we all know that LA is really famous for a few things, but also very much for congestion. And those are the kinds of implications that start to become more and more and more significant as we see this kind of growth. So what we have really, one of the things that we have identified is, of course, that we have some areas very, very close to the city with extremely good access to infrastructure that have very, very low densities. And we'd like to see that transitioning, not a complete reformation of our current lifestyle or of the current urban form that we see in those areas, but an opening up of the different options for different possibilities to occur in those areas. We, again, recommended introducing dual occupancy on a block of land, which we think is a really sensible way of starting to approach those things. And certainly what we do know is that a lot of people that live in those areas that have traditionally been NIMBY areas are starting to experience pressures as their children grow up and look to live close by, for example, as people look to transition into aged care, and that they simply don't have the opportunities available in those areas because they have been quite locked down in a lot of cases. And there's really very little diversity of housing types that's available, and the housing that's available is only available to a very, very, very small slice of our population in terms of the cost of that housing. So what we really are calling for, again, is just greater diversity of housing. We're obviously not the first people to call for that, but we think that that is an unbelievably important element of trying to contribute to that. And really to try and message the NIMBYs that actually it's really important that you consider all of the implications of that really, that focus that has traditionally been on locking down and keeping other people out, and what the implications that are for those people's future as well, as they have to live, very, very far from their families in the future, simply because that kind of growth isn't being supported in areas like this that they live in.
Perhaps one more question before I bring in our next speaker, Allison. With all this body of work that you've done, from a local government perspective, and we've got a lot of councillors in the audience today, how would you recommend, or would you hope that they will use this information as they face decisions related to housing?
So we've called for some pretty significant changes to the way that we approach planning, particularly at a state level. And I just want to make sure that it's really well understood that we're not calling for less local government involvement. What we're looking for here is a real balancing around the state providing that clarity around how we all coexist, and how we can make sure that we are really all moving towards a future that makes sense. We've recommended things like housing targets, which are a mechanism that has worked well in some jurisdictions, but only if local government is on the journey with state government as well. And we think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. So I would really encourage, from a local government perspective, that ongoing collaboration with state government to be able to then achieve that really good outcome for your local constituency around understanding where is growth most appropriate, how can we really think about a different type of future for all of us, and really take into consideration the overall perspective of a much better economy if we do sort out how we actually grow in a reasonable way and in a measured way. And I think that would really help in terms of those kinds of conversations. The last thing I might add, just kind of coming back to your previous question as well, we've done some previous work through a deliberative consultation exercise to look at density and to really understand under what circumstances would density be accepted by local communities. And so we brought in basically a community panel of a wide diversity of people. This is going back a couple of years, and basically said, what would you like? So these people of different ages, people from different backgrounds, people from living in different parts of the state, and really said, what does density look like to you? What would good density look like? And consistency, the two things that we hear are, one, it just needs to have a good urban form, right? So we don't want it to be ugly. We want it to be something that actually considers things like sunlight and and actually good design and reasonable outdoor space is the other really key piece, right? So we want it to look good, and we want it to be somewhere that actually has the amenity that we need to make high density or higher density living a really great experience for people. And that's certainly consistent with the feedback that we had in our Home Choices report this year around people who are living in the new growth areas. A lot of them quite like the experience of living there. What they don't like is the fact that they don't have community centers. They have to travel a long way to get to schools. And that means that they have limited job opportunities because of the time that it takes for them to do those kinds of drop-offs and those kinds of life outcomes and life impacts that they're experiencing as a result of the way that we're growing the city.
Thanks, Allison. We'll come back to you. I imagine that might prompt some comments and some questions. So I'll just remind the audience to use the Q&A or the chat to let us know if you've got a question, or if you're happy to put your question in the Q&A box, please do. Let's move on to bring in Jamie Sutherland now, who's the Director of Local Government and Regional Priorities at Homes Victoria. Jamie, welcome. And perhaps you could start by just very briefly telling us, for those who perhaps don't know, what Homes Victoria is and does.
Yeah, sure. So Homes Victoria is essentially the developer and the steward, if you like, of the social and affordable housing portfolio in Victoria. So predominantly Chris we're about providing that social and affordable housing support to Victoria across the state, and working really closely with, or we are a part of, the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. So really working closely with our operational teams, the operational arms in DFFH, Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, to provide that support service, social and affordable housing, through to the community. And particularly now, there's more movement into that affordable housing space, where traditionally I think the focus from a department perspective has been more in social housing, but now moving more into that affordable housing space. But and just to add to that, Chris, that tight connection with the local government sector as well is becoming more and more important from us from a state perspective, to be able to deliver that, deliver these support services in partnership.
We'll talk a bit more about what that looks like shortly. Leading question though, Jamie, when it comes to leadership in delivering these housing outcomes, what do you see as the critical elements?
Well, I think obviously, let's start with funding. It's critical. We see there, and there's certainly our partners in the local government sector will know from talking to their local communities, the demand for social and affordable housing is real. We see that from a Homes Victoria perspective in the data that we're collecting, whether that be from a Victorian Housing Register, there's a wait list for social housing, or whether it be a rental report that has shown in the recent past affordability has become, housing affordability has become more difficult for the community. So it's clear that supply of social and affordable housing needs to continue, and a key element to that is funding. And again, it's good to see that the state has announced recently more funding coming through, Regional Housing Fund, for example. Federal government has also made recent announcements, but there's obviously no limitless bucket. It isn't a limitless bucket of money. And two, I think fundamental elements to increasing the supply of affordable, social and affordable housing to meet that demand into the future is, one, innovation. So really getting out there and thinking differently as a sector about how we deliver social and affordable housing solutions to the community. And there's a couple of great examples in the local government sector as to how that's happening at the moment, which we could touch on as well, if you like, a bit later. But clearly also partnerships, partnership arrangements across the sector, whether it be state with local government with community housing sector. It's going to be really important into the future that we have those strong partnerships as a sector to get the most out of the money, the funding that we have available coming through at a state, federal, local government level.
Just to go back to that NIMBYism theme that we touched on with Allison, how do you respond in terms of social and affordable housing? The premise that I've sort of picked up is everyone agrees that it's needed, just don't put it next to me. How do you deal with that in your work?
We have Melinda on the line too, who's an expert in consultation, of course. But I think, Chris, the predominant way that I think the message out to the community, it's a bit proof is in the pudding, that the developments that we're delivering now, the housing solutions we're delivering now, is not the same as what it was 50 years ago. And I think for a lot of community members, in their mind, they have a view of what social housing is in particular, but what we are now delivering is different to that. And it's about developing those new housing solutions and proving that to the community, but also consulting well in the planning stages for these developments. So I think Allison touched on it before, just that how we're planning now to integrate housing into the surrounding neighbourhoods, having strong connection to support services around just the built form of the housing itself, integration with open space, just showing that the housing that we're providing now is different to what it was, and it is more in keeping with your local neighbourhoods, I think is critical. And seeing that in the built form now will hopefully help us to sort of navigate that concern.
So what's your advice to councils about how they can work effectively with you, with Homes Victoria, and cultivate those partnerships that you're talking about with others as well, of course.
Chris, just to acknowledge, look, there's some fantastic work being done by local governments at the moment in this space. We're seeing more and more local governments developing their own social and affordable housing strategies. If we think about that message around, or that critical element around innovation, that those in themselves are coming up with new delivery models and ways to go about increasing supply. And so that those, we see that as a huge advantage across the sector. And what that enables us to do with close connection with local governments, which certainly is an emphasis from Homes Victoria to work really closely with the local government sector. But just to have those partnerships in place, to have those strategies in place so that we can see what is needed at a local level in terms of social and affordable housing, what's particular about a local neighbourhood or a local area that we can all understand up front, and that can then start to inform our planning. One, so that we have those really clear local insights into what's needed, because not every community is the same, and there are differences and there's nuances that we need to really appreciate and understand. But also what we can see with these social and affordable housing strategies now is that councils are starting to identify their own opportunities for growth. And if we understand what those opportunities are as a sector, then as the funding continues to come through, we'll be able to all respond as effectively as possible. So yeah, I think that critically important that just those strong partnerships across the sector that we continue to foster, and that's certainly a focus of us at Homes Victoria to help with that.
Jamie, have you got some examples of how, where you've worked with councils, you're getting some runs on the board or making good progress that could paint a picture for people in the audience?
Just generally, I mean, some of the solutions that we're seeing coming through from the local government sector, establishment of social and affordable housing trusts, things like that. There's examples of, and it's to highlight a couple. I know that in, say, Darebin, for example, there was a recent project or a project that's underway where it's in partnership with a community housing provider. Local government have provided the land on a leased basis, a long-term lease basis. There is state funding coming through the big housing build, but that is just an example. And then I believe that there was some mayoral sort of foundational fund coming from local government as well to support that project. So it just shows that example that it needs to be multifaceted, that strong partnership, that is an example of how it is starting to play out clearly. I just picked up a media release came through this morning, and I didn't pick up on all the detail, but it was highlighting another couple of long-term leases that particular local government signed up with a housing provider to provide affordable housing in their local area. So yeah, Chris, it's happening a lot, we can see across the sector, which is fantastic.
And we've got Councillor Suzanne Newton in the audience, who's just supported those comments about the Town Hall Avenue project in Darebin at Preston. And she's saying she'd like to know that there are more projects like that that could be done across Melbourne and Victoria. So you talk about the proof in the pudding. Is that the sort of example that you hope leads to more similar things happening? And how do we get that message out there?
So it's both local government taking those opportunities along with state government, then also obviously as Homes Victoria, we are our own developers of social and affordable housing as well. So we're trying to develop that as effectively as possible. So yeah, I think that, and then it really is the way that we are communicating that to broadly across the state on the success of these projects. And again, I think Melinda's an expert in that, and certainly has helped in a couple of Homes Victoria projects as well. I believe in the planning stage, in really, I think that's critical in getting out to the community, strong consultation in the lead up and the planning stage to show what the solution is going to be or could be and getting that input, but then also post really trying to celebrate the success, I suppose.
Yeah. So we'll come to Melinda in just a moment. Stand by, Melinda. I just want to pick up on a thread that has come through both Allison and Jamie's piece there. And Allison, you might want to comment. This has come from the audience. Peter Maynard at Wyndham is talking about this issue of where the market doesn't support the sort of density that people are arguing is needed. And in the context of the leadership that councils can play there, how do they influence what would appear to be out of their control in terms of what the market wants to do?
And I think that's where the example I provided earlier of local housing targets can be really helpful, because that helps local governments as well to avoid some of these debates when you get into this process, right? And Peter, I've got the utmost sympathy of what you're going through in terms of these conversations, and that, there are these a lot of these live conversations about, will the market support this? And again, the work that we did earlier this year, our Home Choices, we actually did what's called a choice survey. And so we basically asked 6,000 people across Melbourne, Geelong, and Ballarat, and we said, can you please tell us, what of these 4 options would you choose? At this kind of price point, we provided options for renting or buying. We said, how many bedrooms would you need to live in different locations? And we did an iterative process, which actually built a choice model for us that says, here's a number of people that would make a different choice under different circumstances if it was available. And that helps us to understand what the proportion of people is that would choose a different product. And it's actually, some people, as I said, are really, really happy with their experience in greenfield communities and would like the community to be to have some more services, for example, but are really happy with the decision that they've made to live in those areas. Other people would make a different choice, and we know that at the same kind of price point, if the product was available, that people would choose a smaller dwelling size to live closer to the city. And it's about 20% of the people that would otherwise choose a greenfield area. And so those are the people. We're not trying to say that people shouldn't live in new growth areas, but we're going to see those people moving. And therefore, the important thing around those kinds of developers pushing back is around providing that really clear guidance, so everybody understands and everybody's on the same page with that, so that those people that would want to live in that kind of a house, that would want to actually make a different choice than the traditional product that's being developed, have the option and have the opportunity to provide that context and that information into the planning process, which at the moment is not the case.
Thanks, Allison. I want to bring Melinda in now and just remind the audience that we will carve out some time for your questions post talking to Melinda. So please use the Q&A function or the chat function if you want to let us know that you'd like to raise your hand and ask a question. Melinda Jacobsen, Senior Facilitator at MosaicLab. Good afternoon to you and welcome.
Chris, thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you here. I put it to you, Melinda, that the recent announcements from the state have prompted this discussion about community involvement in decision-making. Councils, on the one hand, are saying that's our role to ensure that communities have a say and their voice is reflected here. Messaging from the government perhaps is suggesting less local government involvement is needed. It's a bit of a tightrope we're needing to walk here now, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And as long-time practitioners in the space of deliberative engagement, that would always be our position in encouraging any level of government to engage their citizens or people with lived experience and to be affected by any decisions made, that they're part of a decision-making process. And the deliberation process offers that framework.
So what's your current work telling you about how challenging is it to make sure that the community voice is factored into the decisions at the right time?
Well, I think it's always been an important part of work for any level of government. Certainly with the changes to the Local Government Act a couple of years ago, that's now sort of a big part of the Act, that there is some sort of deliberation process for citizens to be involved in council decisions. And we're continuing to see and continuing to work with a lot of councils all over the state that really value having citizens, as I mentioned, who are going to be most impacted or affected by decisions involved in the process. And I think what's really lovely about the deliberation process is that, very simply, it's about, to Allison's point earlier, having, a representative sample of your community involved with the right time, with the right information and access to experts to deepen their understanding. They can actually come up with really sensible, workable solutions to, as you described earlier, these big wicked problems. And affordable housing is definitely one of those big wicked problems, not only locally here in Victoria, but we know nationally. And it was not that long ago that Allegra Spender in Parliament actually questioned the Prime Minister on why we couldn't use a citizens' assembly to have a conversation about affordable housing at a national level.
So when we spoke in preparation for this, you said a couple of things that have been rattling around in my brain, Melinda, believe it or not, about the barriers here. One of them being that trust is low, but local government needs to lean into that. What did you mean by that?
Deliberation, community engagement can be many things to many people, from a simple survey of constituents right through to, as I said, multi-day deliberation events. But certainly our experience is that with the right level of investment for quality processes, investment into, a random selection of citizens, the deliberation process, as I mentioned, that there are some, the right level of influence that those participants are given to come up with those solutions, and then how council will take those and embed those and help them inform their decisions. It's that classic case of you get what you pay for in community engagement. If you're prepared to invest, then the outcomes will be really solid and meaningful. And I think most importantly, have the community buy-in, because they've been the ones sort of part of that process to come up with those solutions.
When you say invest, are you talking dollars or other resources, or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Obviously, whether councils do it themselves or get practitioners like ourselves, I think it'd be remiss for me not to mention, as experts in this field, we'd be always delighted to work with councils, as we've done for many years, other agencies. There is some investment in putting the right framework and infrastructure around those conversations. And I think the critical part about this is making sure you get those quieter voices, perhaps those parts of the community that might not be as vocal, but still have really important points of view and perspectives to offer in a conversation like this. Because, the reality is affordable housing, there's a huge shortage everywhere. This is everyone's problem. And we all need to be part of the solution.
You're working on a major panel project for the City of Melbourne on affordable housing at the moment. I'm wondering whether you can share with us some insights into how you're gearing up for that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yes, that People's Panel kicks off this coming week. We've got a representative sample of 40 residents that are a cross-section of ages, genders, owners, renters, different cultural backgrounds. And we'll be exploring the question about how can we create more affordable housing in the City of Melbourne. The City of Melbourne have done a lot of work on this, I think touching on some points that have already been made around, notionally the community want to embrace affordable housing, but it gets a bit stuck when they hear that the development might be next door to them. And that's certainly, as the panel's already talked about, perhaps a bit of a legacy on what people understand affordable housing to traditionally be, and that we've got lots of innovation and new beautiful examples to pick up on Allison's point of, nice public realm, that the building is lovely and livable and well designed. But I think the other thing too is, we're changing people's mindsets. I think perhaps my hunch, and I'm yet to test this when we get into the panel, my hunch is that the community still has a particular view on who needs affordable housing. And that's certainly shifted, as we know, more recently. It was interesting for me to attend another panel recently where Allison's colleague Jonathan was there, and the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, who shared that one of the largest emerging cohorts needing affordable housing are actually women in their 50s. So when you start to consider that it's mothers with young families, it's key workers that just want to live close to where they work, nurses, cleaners, baristas, people that would, move about our community. These are the people that need this affordable housing. So as much as it's about what is the building structure and the density in our community, it's also about who's going to live there. And we're looking forward to unpacking that with the People's Panel on behalf of the City of Melbourne.
So you've talked about a few things there that require a bit of a skill set, particularly where councillors get involved in navigating those conversations and, understanding their responsibilities. How do we help councillors build those skills that they need to be able to effectively navigate this space?
It's I think it comes down to deep listening. People come with a perspective. They come with passion around an issue. When I heard you use a particular term to describe people that don't like development in their backyard, we would caution on language use, to be respectful. It's all about people. People are passionate about issues that are really important to them. And, we can all think of something that's really important to us. So people coming into this conversation are no different, whether that's people that actually need this housing or people that are going to be welcoming it and supporting it in their community. Everyone has a perspective, and there's something to be learned by keeping an open mind. Changing minds is hard, right? We've all got brain biases that are built over many years of observation and lived experience and help us make shortcuts to be efficient. But if given time and the opportunity to express views and think slowly about these things, people can have the opportunity to shift. So listening, I think, is probably the summary. Just listen.
Excellent. Thank you, Melinda. We might pause and see if we can bring in some audience participation now. And I see a question in the chat from Amanda McNeil, who says, what do you say to the comment that community and councils find the planning processes give them little or no say about what they do and don't want in their community? And Amanda's talking about a lack of consultation and the centralisation of decision-making in her council area and Whitehorse, and the impact on suburbs surrounding high-density areas such as Box Hill. Any of the panellists care to comment on that challenge?
I'm happy to have a go, Chris, and thank you very much, Councillor McNeil, for the question. Certainly, very familiar with some of the challenges that you have in Box Hill in terms of providing the certainty to your community around the development that you are seeing and around preserving land. I think there was another question about that as well, for delivery of the types of community services that are needed. I think this was Councillor Masood that was asking that question. And really that's the kind of work that we absolutely want to see. And again, in terms of the approach that we would suggest, it is about making sure that we have that greater certainty and that better cooperation between state and local governments, right? Certainly the situation in Box Hill has been going on for a very long time in terms of trying to provide your community that certainty, and that's a challenge for everybody, right? And so our recommendation has been, as I said, to try and set those local housing targets, which Box Hill is an incredibly good example of an area that's really embraced the opportunity for greater density, but really assisting in terms of from now, where are there areas that any further growth happens, and what kind of infrastructure will support that growth, and making sure that you understand that. In our most recent work that we just put out today, we have looked at the type of infrastructure that's required to support different population growth in different areas, and trying to forecast that land in established areas is more expensive, and we do expect that delivering schools and community facilities will be more expensive in those areas going forward. And we need to really proactively plan for that and make sure that we understand those implications to avoid getting ourselves into a situation where we're paying top dollar to acquire areas that are already built upon to deliver the types of services that we need for the population growth that we're seeing. That's not a situation that anyone wants to be in, right? So actually being able to plan forward and ensure that you have that kind of forward pipeline that you can understand and see, and working in collaboration with state government would really be the ideal that we would really encourage, but absolutely recognize the challenges that you're facing now.
Thanks, Allison. Jamie or Melinda, care to add to that, or we'll move on? No? Good, just checking. Councillor Mike Bodsworth from Surf Coast, any perspectives on the link between car dependency and affordable, sustainable housing, and how can councils be supported to retrofit good active transport infrastructure into existing neighbourhoods? This one's right up your alley, I'd say, Allison.
Absolutely, and a fantastic question, Councillor Bodsworth. And certainly there is absolutely a link between car dependency and the need for affordable sustainable. And we know that car dependency entrenches existing exacerbates existing challenges from a socioeconomic perspective. We know that having good affordable sustainability housing of the type that that Jamie and Melinda have both spoken to in areas that are much closer to public transport and active transport opportunities does provide people with the opportunity to consider whether or not they require a car. And certainly that the cost of running a car is really borne, generally speaking, in a city that is continuing to expand in the way that we are by those that least able to afford it. And we know that from an environmental perspective, that obviously has impacts as well, both for them and for all of us in our environment. One thing that we did recommend is really to think about providing greater options for home buyers in their parking options that they have. Currently, we're really locked into to requiring developers of those actually building homes to having a certain proportion of parking that's required. That's a slightly different question to the one that you're asking, which is really about retrofitting existing neighborhoods. And certainly good active transport infrastructure is something that we have called for in our strategy, and in terms of the support that's required to really deliver on that. We are absolutely 100% supportive of the opportunity to be able to provide some additional support to local governments, recognizing the challenge that you have in terms of trying to provide that. But really, in terms of the first step on that is if there's any possibility of reserving land for those future investments, that's absolutely something that we would really endorse, because that's kind of the first step, is having the ability and having the space to be able to deliver that infrastructure at a future time. That's not always possible, but where it is possible, it's really important to preserve the option for that to come forward. But yes, very much. That's absolutely what we would like to be seeing in areas of the Surf Coast.
Thanks, Allison. Great question, Councillor Bodsworth. There is time for a couple more questions, audience, if you'd like to pop them in the Q&A or the chat, or let me know that you'd like to ask a question live. I believe we have the technical capability to do that. Councillor Chris Meadows-Taylor out at Central Goldfields Shire is talking about the need to balance population growth with the substantial legacy community infrastructure that's needed to support that growth. And this has come up a little already in some of the discussion. As the second bottom LGA on the CEFA index, Chris is really interested in how to address the social inequity issues and interested on the panel's view of this, recommending some portion of current state housing funds be set aside for this purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question, and certainly again, and I'm sure that you probably haven't seen the work from today, but one of the things that we have called for is really significant considerations to support water in regional areas as one of the kind of the enabling infrastructures that we can see that's under the most significant pressure from kind of the future projections that we have. As well as, of course, digital infrastructure, which is really still lagging behind in regional and rural areas, which compounds some of the issues that we have, not only for participation of individuals in things like having digitally enabled education or work opportunities, but also for businesses that are seeking to be able to participate in an online market where they have an unreliable internet connection is just really unacceptable in our state to be able to support those areas. So certainly those are two of the things. Electricity infrastructure is the other one that we're really conscious of that regional areas require in terms of that forward planning and certainty and investment around making sure that we are preparing all of our areas as they need to be for that future population growth. So certainly, Chris, absolutely appreciate that perspective, and certainly the challenge of existing infrastructure and legacy community infrastructure is not going to be made any more straightforward by some of the challenges that we have coming as well. Things like, we can see the requirement to kind of transition community infrastructure in regional areas from gas to electric, and we're conscious that most, if not all, local government areas simply don't have the funds to be able to even start planning for that purpose, and that is well above and beyond the existing commitment that you already have to deliver your services. So it's something that we are we've articulated to a certain extent within the report that's come out today around the need to really provide that greater funding certainty for those particular types of infrastructure that are of greatest importance, particularly now for enabling that regional growth, but also we'll continue to work on a range of those different issues.
We've all got a bit of reading to catch up on with that report that's come out today. Jamie, I'm wondering if you've got a perspective on that infrastructure issue in the projects that you're working on at Homes Victoria. How do you factor that in?
Yeah, certainly. Chris, it's definitely a factor, and our planning from a strategic perspective needs to look at into the future, where are those support services going to be across the state, so that we can position that housing, understand where they're going to be. And coming back to, I think, the original question around areas where there is socioeconomic disadvantage, and making sure that we are providing housing or planning for housing as far in advance as possible to match the support services that are going to help people with their lives. So I think, Chris, to put it simply, it's about planning as far in advance, linking up with the broader strategies, the state government strategies and the like, around where those infrastructure upgrades are going to be, being as far in front of that as possible, so that we can place the housing support in those areas as well.
Melinda, it's just occurred to me, when you're putting together representative panels, do you look for a level of knowledge on these types of issues, or do you just hope that sort of comes through naturally?
No, and I think that's the beauty of a randomized selection process. I think we need to give credit to our community members. It comes back to, as long as there's enough time for them to receive, hear, understand, interrogate information, and that can come in multiple forms, whether that's background reports or wider engagement, surveys of community sentiments on issues, or experts in a conversation or panel Q&A. As long as there's the time for them to digest and discuss and deliberate and interrogate that information, you'd be surprised how informed a representative sample can come up to speed on topics they would know nothing about at the start, to then come with some really interesting solutions. And I suspect that's got something to do with the fact that it's fresh eyes. They're hearing and learning this stuff for the first time, so they're not coming with any preconceived ideas or baggage or point of view. And then together as a group, they work their way through the material to find solutions.
Yeah. And I guess you're saying there's an obligation on whoever's bringing the panel together to help them come to an informed position on those issues they're being asked to provide insights on.
Well, it's correct. And the right sort of information that's going to help them understand the issue to consider. And the key here is a clear remit, or the clear question that we're being asked, or we're asking of the panel. And then, combined with, well, what's the level of influence? Are the recommendations, for example, that this group of people are going to provide, how a council or a level of government going to take those into their decision-making process? Is it, we will do everything you say, or it will help inform, and where we can't accommodate a recommendation, we'll be able to tell you why? So that level of influence really is I think the secret sauce around building trust in government processes, is councils, governments following through on what they say they're going to do.
So Ron Eason in the chat has dropped a question noting that every rural area is significantly behind on housing issues and transport. Now, I did note Rural Councils Victoria launched a major housing action plan this week that I'm sure looks at those issues in particular. Allison or Jamie, or both, in terms of Ron's question, what do you see coming forward from government in that respect?
It's an incredibly important issue, and certainly we're very conscious of the real need for more housing, and yes, you said in every rural area and every regional area, and the real pressures that people are experiencing of not being able to access secure housing at a whole range of price points. So certainly from the housing perspective, again, one of the things that we'd really like to see is just that greater certainty around where the housing needs to go, and then backing that up with actual delivery of housing. Jamie, I'm sure, can speak to delivering that social and affordable housing, which is certainly a key part of regional housing issues right now, is not having availability for key worker housing to even build further housing is one of the issues that again continues to exacerbate those challenges. From a transport perspective, again, that is another one that is consistently an issue. And we're conscious right now that every part of the state is experiencing issues, but particularly for regional and rural areas. The other recommendation, or the other element of the recommendation that we made, was really around public transport, and we're conscious that public transport is simply not an option for many regional and rural areas at the moment. That it's doesn't run frequently enough to be useful, doesn't necessarily go where you need to go, and doesn't necessarily provide the level of service that's required for people that are required to use it. So that's something that we're continuing to do some work on. But certainly from government's plans, we haven't seen as much around that rural housing challenge. Of course, we know that following the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games, the state government did commit to continuing to deliver housing in regional areas, even without the games happening. But I'm guessing from your question, Ron, that's not the kind of solution that your particular area is looking for, but certainly an issue that I think government's very, very alive to.
I think one of the comments that resonated with me from Mary Ann Brown when they launched that report earlier this week, Allison, was rural is not regional. And a lot of the attention's been placed on development in regional spaces that perhaps rural feels like it's potentially going to be left behind. Is that a factor for you, Jamie?
I wouldn't say it's a factor, Chris. It's got to come into our planning. So it's good to see there is funding coming through specifically for regional areas, and I use that word regional again, but it's certainly not specifically allocated to that sort of regional stereotypical city. And although we don't have the exact details yet on how that funding is going to be distributed, there is obviously a need across rural, regional Victoria that needs to continue to be addressed. So it is recognised. It's been recognised recently in these funding announcements. I think, Allison, you mentioned the housing statement earlier as well, that started to touch on it as well. So there is a fair bit of planning and initiative being taken across the board, I think, Chris. So although the detail is not completely known yet, I'm pretty confident that it can be continued to be addressed.
Thanks, Jamie. Conscious of time, so we need to start to wrap this up. I have one more question for the panel, whoever wants to sort of tackle this. Mindful that it's not always easy to get engagement from communities on these issues. They're busy, they've got lots of other things challenging them, and they often just miss the opportunity to be part of these discussions, don't they? So from a councillor perspective, what advice can you give them to, build and encourage that capacity in the community to be part of these conversations?
I'm guessing Melinda might like to jump in.
Melinda, you've been nominated.
Who got to the mute button first? It's such a good question, and oh gosh, it's probably the $64 million question, because you're right, life's busy. Like, people's lives are busy, and they're not always tuned into the places where you can find this information. However, the ones that are really tuned in are often the ones that are always in touch with council about this. My advice is probably find out where people go. There's lots of community groups, sporting activities. Where do people meet and gather, and how do you tap into those existing networks? And often not the obvious ones. I would really encourage councils to think a bit laterally around the quieter voices, or people they don't tend to hear from a lot, and find key community leaders to tap into those networks. So it's often the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, or the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders, the young people, people living with disabilities. They're all the ones that are often have additional barriers to engaging in community issues. So I think laterally and go where those community groups are.
I think that's a really good point, and I'm reminded of a council in Western Australia that very recently did just that. They rolled out some AI technology and QR codes into parks and playgrounds, every one of them across their city, and encouraged people to engage on the topic then and there. So good advice, Melinda. Allison, any thoughts from you?
I mean, Melinda did an excellent job at summarising. I think the other, councillors, I mean, you already know how to engage with your communities. I think the particular challenge is often the way to engage on some of these topics that can be so polarizing, which again, you'll be more familiar with than I will. But certainly what we try to do is to provide as many of our resources as available publicly open. I've just responded to one of the questions in the chat from Councillor McNeil about the link to the report that came out today. That is publicly available on our website, as is the supporting information that we used to develop our report itself. We try to publish all of our underlying reports. If there's an issue that you think we can help you with, or there's an issue that you think we haven't explored fully, by all means, please reach out. We would love to understand that. And certainly in terms of the way that you engage with your community, we hope that our resources can help to provide some of the additional evidence and context that might be useful for you to navigate some of those conversations with the community, as well as with state government. We often do talk about state and local and the relationship between them in our work, because it is so absolutely critically important to getting planning and infrastructure right. And we really do need that partnership to be effective in order to be able to safeguard the interests of all Victorians, and to really get a future that we all collectively think is a future that we can work towards collectively. And that's obviously where the challenges are, but that's our hope, is that our materials can be somewhat helpful in helping to provide the forum for that conversation to happen.
Great summary there. Allison, we'll take that as some final comments from you, and I'll give Jamie the opportunity to perhaps wrap up his thoughts on that question, or anything else you want to leave the audience with.
Just back up what Allison just mentioned then about partnership arrangements too, and just to reiterate that is clearly from state, local government, in our sector, the community housing sector, just so important that we continue to foster those partnerships and relationships, and working together to seek consultation with our local communities and local insights from those communities.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you to all of our panellists, Jamie Sutherland from Homes Victoria, Dr. Allison Stewart from Infrastructure Victoria, and Melinda Jacobsen from MosaicLab. It's been great to have you with us and to hear your thoughts on this very challenging and complex topic today. And it's just the start of the conversation, the VLGA series of panel discussions on housing. We will be sending out, as you know, a recording of this for anyone who's registered, but we've got so much more to come. So please save the dates for these upcoming sessions in the series. On the 10th of November, looking specifically at short stay accommodation taxes. Are they a solution to Victoria's rental housing crisis, or are they a tourism dilemma? Could they, in fact, be both? We have Felicia Mariani from the Victorian Tourism Industry Council, Councillor Brian Hood, the Mayor of Hepburn Shire, and Rachel Hornsby from Hornsby & Co., all confirmed for that session on Friday, the 10th of November. So if you had lunch plans, cancel them and get your reservation in for that. On the 24th of November, housing key workers in Victorian towns and cities. Still working on the panel, but I'm reminded that rural housing action plan that came out this week talks about the terrific initiative down in Moyne Shire, where they've thought outside the box and delivered some innovations in terms of accommodating key workers. And we do have a global executive panel coming up that might interest you. This is the one we do in partnership with LGIU, involving senior executives from the UK and Australia. So on the 9th of November, we have Ian Walker from the New Democracy Foundation, Scott Waters, the CEO of Moreton Bay City Council in Queensland, Kirsten England, the former Chief Executive of the City of Bradford Metropolitan District Council in England, and Paddy Mahon, the Chief Executive of Longford County Council in Ireland, all joining us for a global panel on community engagement done well. That's on the 9th of November. VLGA.org.au and go to the events page to secure your place for those events. I think they're all the housekeeping notes I need to finish up. Thank you to the audience for being part of the session today and for your terrific questions. We hope to see you at a future event here from VLGA Connect. If you'd like to follow up with anyone in the team about things we've discussed today, drop a note in the Q&A and we'll reach out to you shortly, and keep an eye out for the recording of our webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon on VLGA Connect.